radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up on The Political Correction, we're talking about the summer of discontent proposed by the RMT union, the Sunday Times rich list and the cost of living crisis. All of that plus plenty more after your latest news with Bethany.
Good morning. It's just gone 10 o'clock. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. Number 10 says the Prime Minister did not request a meeting with senior civil servant Sue Gray, and that he hasn't tried to influence the outcome of her investigation into Partygate in any way. Labour called on Boris Johnson to urgently explain what they'd discussed, with Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner saying people deserve to know the truth. Two cabinet ministers have objected to imposing a windfall tax on oil and gas firms as a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis. The Northern Ireland Secretary has said it won't work and will put off investors in the sector. And the Health Secretary says a warning sudden taxes can have long-term impact on businesses. Labour's calling for a one-off levy on firms profiting from globally high oil and gas prices, using the revenue to ease the burden of rising household bills. The government could introduce a minimum staff requirement during rail strikes. It comes as unions threaten major industrial action over pay. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps told the Sunday Telegraph ministers are considering new laws to make industrial action illegal unless a certain number of people are working. Political commentator Portia Berry-Kilby told GB News rail strikes aren't a sensible or compassionate move during a cost of living crisis.
By creating even more complications to people's commute to work, it might threaten other people's ability to earn money. It doesn't really seem the most sensible or even the most compassionate of decisions. Grant Shapps, by saying that there will not be kind of all power to the unions, is making a stand and saying that things have to change, and unions, all very well and good, can represent to some extent, but also can't kind of hold a gun to the government's head.
The Foreign Secretary has stressed the government cast iron commitment to the Good Friday Agreement after meeting US politicians. Liz Truss said they discussed the importance of free trade amid heightened tensions over the post-Brexit deal on Northern Ireland. It follows US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's warning that Congress wouldn't support a free trade deal with the UK if it discards the post-Brexit agreement. In Ukraine, the country has ruled out a ceasefire or concessions to Moscow as Russian forces intensify an offensive in the eastern region of Donbass. Ukraine's presidential advisor says Kyiv wouldn't accept any deal that involves giving up territory. US President Joe Biden has signed a bill to provide £30 billion in military, economic and humanitarian aid to the country. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has cut off its gas supply to Finland after they'd refused Moscow's demands to pay in rubles. Survivors of the Manchester Arena terror attack are marking its 5th anniversary today with a 10-kilometre race through the city. More than 20,000 people, including the Mayor, Andy Burnham, will take part in the Great Manchester Run. It's in memory of the 22 people that were killed when a bomb was detonated at an Ariana Grande concert on the 22nd of May 2017. Colin Parry, who lost his 12-year-old son, Tim, in the attack, says he hasn't felt anger towards what happened, only grief.
It was a gruesome event for the bomber to target a pop concert where he must have known the huge majority of the audience would be children, young people. It was the most callous of bombings. Any attack, of course, on civilians is beyond reproach, but that was particularly awful.
Australia's Labour Party will form the country's new government from tomorrow, making way for a greener way of living. Voters, mostly women, campaigning for climate change, targeted seats held by Scott Morrison's Liberal Party, ending 9 years of a Conservative coalition. A Canberra University professor spoke of a fierce desire to get accountability back into Australian politics. Local media reports Labour, which hasn't been in power since 2013, is just short of a majority 76 seats and may need support of smaller independent parties. And the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall are set to make a cameo in a TV soap by guest starring in a special episode of EastEnders. It's to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Charles and Camilla will surprise residents of Albert Square at a street party held to celebrate the monarch's 70 years on the throne. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, let's get back to political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. I'm Deanna Davison, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry and by Arlene Foster in Northern Ireland. We are here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we're talking about proposed strikes from the RMT union and warnings we're approaching a summer of discontent. We're joined by the CEO of a company who help households stay vigilant in the face of rising prices. And we discuss the prestigious Sunday Times Rich List, which this year featured Chancellor Rishi Sunak and his wife Akshata Murthy. And as always here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you today. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on the show, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. The General Secretary of the RMT union, Mick Lynch, has warned that a proposed rail strike would bring the country to a standstill, prompting Transport Secretary Grant Shapps to consider drawing up laws requiring a minimum number of rail staff to work during a strike. And if those numbers were not met, the industrial action would be deemed illegal. It's also been revealed that the Education Secretary Nadeem Zahawi is examining plans to bolster the rights of teachers who choose not to join unions. Well, it's a union story, so where else to start but with our very own Paul Embry. Paul, what do you make of these proposals?
Well, I think they're wrong. I think they seek to change the goalposts. I mean, if we believe in the right to strike, then it seems to me that if you then put obstacles in the way of as a government to try to make it virtually impossible to strike, then probably you don't believe in the right to strike in the first place. And I think any civilised modern democracy should defend the right of people to withdraw their labour if they believe they've got a genuine grievance. And these proposals from government to make it more difficult for people to strike seem to me to be a bit like a boxer who, having started the boxing match and knows the rules, gets hit and suddenly says, well, I don't want you to hit me hard again, so I'm going to order you to fight with one hand tied behind your back. And the truth is, Deanna, where has this come from? It's come from the fact that workers are sick and tired of having to pay the price for an economic situation that was not of their making. First of all, the financial crisis, now the cost of living crisis. For a decade, they had to put up with austerity. Now they're struggling to make ends meet as a result of the cost of living crisis. Many workers, both in the public sector and the private sector, have not had decent pay increases for many years. They see directors' pay running away at a rate far more than their own pay does. And frankly, people have had enough, and they're organising through their collective institutions, their trade unions, to hit back, and I think they're right to do so, and I think the Tories should listen to them rather than trying to crush them.
No, but there's a difference between, you know, a small-scale strike that's going to affect your employer and a strike that is potentially going to shut down the transport system of an entire country, holding the country to ransom. Can't you see how annoyed people are going to get by this, Paul?
Well, I think, look, if you're a trade unionist and if you're a trade union that's taking industrial action, then I don't think it's right or reasonable to expect the trade union to take action and to choose tactics that reduce its own leverage. Plainly, as a trade union, and you're trying to win a dispute, you are going to try to maximise your leverage. That's not unreasonable to me, and I don't think it's surprising. Just as the government and an employer would seek to do exactly the same thing from their point of view to try to undermine the strike action. But look, as I said, Deanna, people in this country are struggling to make ends meet. For a long time now, they've had to pay the price of decisions taken by others, of decisions taken by government, of crimes that were committed by the bankers. And they've been told, look, you have to pay the price of those decisions. And I think they're at the end of their tether. And it's a long time, frankly, since we had concerted industrial action in this country on a widespread and on a national scale. But the point that I would make is workers don't resort to that unless they think they're genuinely justified. When people take strike action, they lose money themselves. And during a cost of living crisis, that is going to have a particularly acute effect on them. They're doing it because they feel that they're justified, and rather than trying to take the big stick approach, which is what the government is doing, get around the table, listen to their grievances, listen to the fact that real wages are falling, listen to the fact that, you know, austerity has had a real impact over the last decade and people are struggling to put food on the table. And then, if they listen, then they might have a proper solution.
So, Arlene, I want to bring you in on this. What do you make of the fact that the RMT are proposing these kind of wide-scale strikes? And do you think the government is justified in the action that they want to take?
Well, first of all, Paul's right. Workers will suffer if unions go on strike. But of course, that's always the case. It's the workers that suffer. It's not the union bosses that will suffer as a result of the strike that they're pushing. And I think it's quite disgraceful to read Mick Lynch's comments today as if he's celebrating the fact that he's going to have the biggest general strike since 1926, as if that's something that should be celebrated. There's no reality in respect of what's being proposed here, because workers will suffer. And I think it points again to the fact that trade unions are actually out of touch with the people that they are supposed to be representing. They should be representing them on the cost of living crisis. They should be representing them on the issues that matter to them. And we talked about this last week in terms of the student unions, the way in which a lot of unions have become so politicised that they've got themselves involved in a lot of issues that, frankly, they shouldn't be involved in. And I thought it was very interesting to read this morning that in terms of the education unions, only 30% believe, I think it was, that they are satisfied with the support that they gain from their union when they need their union. Their union should be there to support them when they're in difficulties, when they need their help, instead of all of this grandstanding around general strikes and trying to hold people to ransom.
And what about the government's proposed measures then? Because my understanding is it's looking specifically at ensuring there's a minimum number of people working so that essential services can remain. Do you think that sort of strikes the right balance?
Well, I do, because I think government has a responsibility to the wider public to make sure that public services are available for them when they need those public services. And that's why they're looking at putting these legislative pieces in place to try and protect the public, whilst union leaders are pushing ahead with strikes, which they know are going to cause great disservice to the general public. But despite that, they intend to push ahead, which I think is completely wrong.
Paul?
Well, I think it's impractical, because effectively what the government would be doing there is by saying there has to be a minimum number of people in work, they would be ordering union members to cross the picket line, to cross a picket line which is being manned by other union members. Now, frankly, it's a cardinal sin within the trade union movement to cross a picket line. It's something that you don't do. And if the government thinks it's wise to effectively order people to do it, then I suspect they're going to get a reaction that might surprise them. And I just think on a moral level, actually, it's wrong, because you're saying to a trade union, yes, you know, of course we defend your right to strike, and yes, we accept that you've had a democratic ballot and a majority of your members have chosen to withdraw their labour, but actually we're going to ignore that, and what we're going to do is to send some of your members into work anyway. Well, I mean, that's a way effectively of rendering the right to strike meaningless. Because what you do is say, well, any impact that the strike is likely to have in terms of leverage on the employer becomes completely diminished. And you know, as I say, we've already got in this country some of the most restrictive trade union laws in the advanced industrial world. It is not easy to go on strike in Britain. And when the Trade Union Act came in a few years ago, set minimum thresholds for turnouts, etc., it became even harder to take strike action. And like I said, Deanna, the truth is that people do not do it as a first resort. I've been on strike on a few occasions. I've stood on picket lines. I know how difficult it is. You agonise over the decision, particularly somebody like me in the fire service. You agonise over the decision, and you know the impact that it's going to have on your family financially as well. But you do it because you've got a genuine grievance. And if anyone can say to me that workers in this country have not got a genuine grievance after 12 years of an economic situation that they have had to pay for and that they've had to bear the brunt of, then I would say you're on a different planet to me. And rather than, as I say, take the sledgehammer approach, what the government needs to do is understand why workers are reacting like this, understand why they're threatening to take to picket lines, listen to their reasoning, get around the table and stop the inflated and the combative rhetoric.
But Paul, you talk about the rights of the workers who are within that trade union to go on strike, but what about the rights of ordinary people, other workers, to actually get to work? You know, this is absolutely key core infrastructure. Surely the government has a responsibility to everyone else to keep that going.
Well, what I would say, Deanna, is if you take that argument to its logical conclusion, then you effectively rule out the right to strike. That's where that argument takes you. Because, of course, by definition, any strike, any industrial action will cause disruption to operations. I mean, let's be brutally honest. That's the purpose of taking strike action in the first place, because, you know, you want to withdraw your labour in order to send a message to your employer or the government, whoever it is, that this is what we are worth, this is what can happen if we weren't here. I think if you come along and say, well, you know, we because other people have got to get to work, we're effectively just going to rule your strike illegal, then I think that's a nuclear option, really, and one that I have to say is not commensurate with a modern democratic society where workers should have the right to withdraw their labour. No one wants to see a summer of discontent, by the way. Nobody wants to see public services come to a halt. But there's a reason why it's happening, and it's the anger that is bubbling away beneath the surface of people who feel that they're just at the end of their tether after being forced to pay the price for decisions that are made by government and bankers. And like I say, the responsible, reasonable thing for a government to do is not to say we're effectively going to ban your strike action as good as, but yes, you've got a grievance, we know your real wages are falling, we know you've suffered austerity, we know you're struggling to put food on the table. Let's have a plan to deal with that instead.
Arlene, I want to come back to something you said there, which was about unions often getting overly politicised and getting a little bit out of touch with their actual membership. To me, it feels like the reason that the strike, particularly in London, has been called on Jubilee weekend is not just to cause the maximum possible disruption. To me, that feels very politically charged in some sort of weird anti-monarchy sentiment from some of these highly politicised union leaders. Do you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, the fact that they are targeting the Jubilee weekend, the fact that it's going to impact, I understand, on the stations which are right beside Buckingham Palace, Green Park, I think is one of the stations affected. I understand there's been a grievance between the employees and management in and around that area now for some time. Why it hasn't been dealt with, I don't know. But to target Jubilee weekend is malicious, and it actually is very damaging, I think, for those of us who want to celebrate the Jubilee weekend, to look on and see you're only doing this because it's a celebration of the monarchy, and you're doing it this weekend to cause as much annoyance as you possibly can. And I think it's completely wrong. And that threat to strike on Jubilee weekend should be removed. And it should be removed very quickly, because I think the unions need to have the support of the public. I think Paul will recognise that if they're going on strike. And if they're doing something as politically charged as that, they will lose support. And I think they need to withdraw it immediately.
Paul, I'm curious about that. Do you think tactically this has been a bit of a miscalculation by the unions? Because this is really, really going to frustrate people, isn't it? And as Arlene said, you're not going to have the support of the public.
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I think that it's not just trade unionists who are quite angry at the situation that they're finding themselves in at the moment. I think it's millions of workers across the country, not just in the public sector, but the private sector as well. But what I would say, Deanna, on the broader point about trade unions, let's not lose sight of the fact that pretty much every advance that has ever been won by working people in this country has come about as a result of trade unions, as a result of trade union campaigning. You know, whether it's the national minimum wage, whether it's decent health and safety laws, whether it's annual leave, for example, protections in the workplace, decent pay and conditions and pensions and so on. No employer or government ever comes along to a group of workers and hands them these things on a plate. Workers have to organise through their collective institutions and to fight and to struggle in order to secure them. And that's historically what the trade union movement has done in Britain. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that every action that is ever taken by a trade union everybody has to agree with, but it certainly is to recognise the importance of trade unions in delivering for workers over the generations. And there are workers today who enjoy much better conditions of service and better protections in the workplace, not just in the public sector but the private as well, as a result of that sustained campaigning by trade unions. Let's never forget that.
Well, Oh, of course, Arlene.
I just wanted to ask Paul about the poll that was carried out in education unions, which has come back to say that only 30% believe that they get the support that they need. I have to say that is reflected in my experience when I was a member of the Legislative Assembly here in Northern Ireland. When I went to trade unions to try and get them to support some of my constituents, they would support them so far, and then they dropped them just as they were about to go into a tribunal. So I recognise that statistic, and I have to say it is disappointing that actually unions aren't supporting the people that they should be supporting and instead involving themselves in politics. Do you recognise that?
Well, I would be the first to say, Arlene, that some trade union leaderships on certain issues, I think, are out of touch with their members. I mean, I've said that publicly. I think that unions are not so good these days at concentrating on the bread and butter issues affecting their members, pay and conditions in the workplace, which arguably these summer disputes we're talking about do focus on those issues. I think there are some trade union leaderships that have followed a kind of almost like a militant woke line that does not rest easy with millions of their members, and actually as a result of that have alienated millions of their members, and that's actually a battle that I've had within the trade union movement personally. So yeah, of course, you know, there are internal things that go on within trade unions that members are not happy with. I get that. But broadly speaking, as a principle, I think trade unions are absolutely a force for good in our country. As I said, they've delivered many, many positive things for workers over the generations. And whatever our individual criticisms of certain trade union leaderships, we shouldn't lose sight of that fact.
Well, we want to hear from you. Let us know, what do you think? Do you think these strikes are justified? Do you think the government's action is justified? Let us know by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk. And most importantly, don't go anywhere, because coming up after the break, we're joined by the CEO of a company who say they are helping households stay vigilant in the face of rising prices. As I say, if you want to get involved in this conversation, email us gbviews@gbnews.uk, tweet us @gbnews, and see you in a few minutes.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Chancellor Rishi Sunak is under increasing pressure to help more households as the cost of living crisis reaches record highs. And millions around the country feel the impact on their daily lives. But what exactly can the Chancellor do to ease the steep increase in prices? And indeed, what can individuals do to ensure they stay afloat in these economically turbulent times? Well, joining us now to discuss this is Greg Marsh, who's the founder and CEO of Nous, which describes itself as a company that helps households get smart and stay vigilant against the rising cost of living. Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. So you've got a pretty important job at the moment. Tell me kind of how much engagement you're getting from people to try and find these money-saving tips.
We've been inundated with people coming to our services and our website trying to find out more about what they can do, practical advice and practical tips. One of the things that we've been tracking over the last few months is that while there is increasing awareness among householders of how serious this problem is. People are now talking to their friends, they're talking to their neighbours, they're having these conversations around the cost of living crisis. Most people in the UK still think this is not going to happen to them. They still think this is someone else's problem before it's their own. Now, those on lower incomes, those on universal credit or who benefit from the Warmer Homes discount, they're really feeling it already. But the challenge is that over the next few months, as energy prices rise further, and as other cost of living costs kick in, this is a problem that's really going to hit all of us. It's going to hit middle income households. It's going to even hit higher income households. We're all going to have to make very significant changes to how we spend our money, what we spend our money on in order to navigate through this very tough period for UK households.
So can we talk about some of the kind of key tips that you're giving people? And I think one area I probably want to touch upon is energy, because energy is a huge concern at the moment. What advice can you give people on that front?
The challenge is there's very little you can really do to reduce the costs of your energy bills other than changing how much energy you consume. Now, we've all heard about how serious that is for some families. We've had people get in touch with us telling us that they are literally feeling suicidal because of their rising energy bills and how serious that's affecting their homes. We've had people tell us that they are literally struggling or having to make impossible choices about whether to be warm enough or whether to feed their children. So this is not an easy problem, and many households already have made practical changes to how they consume energy. They're having shorter showers in the morning. They're trying to make sure they've dialed their thermostat down. But honestly, it's patronizing for us to sort of give people advice. People who really have already felt the pinch know that, and they're doing what they can. There's not that much you can do in terms of finding cheaper deals. There may be other places that you can cut your costs. One of the key things you can do is get smart about all the other things you buy every month. About 16 million UK households are out of contract for a broadband or mobile phone provider, or their car or home insurance has been allowed to roll on to a higher price deal because they haven't shopped for a cheaper one. So one of the things that our service at Now.co does, and there are other similar tools out there, is it makes a list of all the things that you're spending money on every month or every year, and make sure you go through those with a fine-tooth comb and say, right, am I out of contract? Could I find a cheaper deal? And what else is out there? And to be honest, do I even need to buy this? You know, the things that we all had to have around us during the lockdown when we had nothing else to do. Well, the weather's nice. You can go outside now. There are cheaper ways of entertaining yourselves than those expensive subscription services. And maybe now's the time to make those tough decisions.
And I want to talk a little bit about government intervention so far. The government's gone so far, but if you could send a message to government right now, what would it be?
We think that the government will have to go further, and we think that some of the initiatives that we saw in the Chancellor's spring statement, for instance, the £200 energy bills support scheme, which has provided, or will provide, I should say, some little comfort to households, we think that's going to have to go further. We would suggest that there might need to be an extension to that scheme. The debate about windfall taxes for the energy companies, you know, whether or not you levy a windfall tax doesn't actually affect the households who are currently feeling the pinch. That affects how the government pays for whatever additional measures that it might need to introduce. So again, we think the real debate is not whether you fine the energy companies or whether you find the money under the pillows and, you know, at the Treasury. The real question is how you make sure that households who most need help get it. One of the shocking bits of information that came to light about a week ago was from the Office of National Statistics, who shared that the lowest income households, so those on the lowest quintile of income, about 40% of those households were now struggling to pay their bills on time. And the challenge is that's a proportion that's only rising as time goes on. So we believe that the government will have to do more. We think that there will need to be intercession. One of the things they could do, for instance, is use the existing regulators, Ofcom and Ofgem, who regulates the communications industry and the energy industry, to put more pressure on the regulated providers of energy, the regulated providers of mobile phone services and broadband services, to ensure that those companies aren't increasing their prices above the rate of inflation, which is something many of them are doing. But again, it's incumbent on all of us as households to get smart about what we're spending on, make sure if we're out of contract that we've got a better deal, and use the tools like Now.co and others that are out there to get smart about your household finances and make a plan.
Brilliant. Well, Greg, thank you so much for those tips there and for your insights. That's Greg Marsh, the founder and CEO of Nous. But we're moving from cost of living onto something interesting. Sunday Times Rich List has been published for this year, and it's found that Britain's super rich have grown their combined fortunes by 8% to a record $710 billion in the last 12 months. The 34th edition of the prestigious rankings identify a record 177 UK billionaires. And Chancellor Rishi Sunak becomes the first frontline politician to be ranked amongst the country's richest people. Well, earlier here on GB News, the compiler of the list, Robert Watts, told us why the list is so important for transparency.
We realised in February time, we'd sort of locked onto the fact that the Chancellor and his family would feature onto the Sunday Times Rich List in the past, and I think that he sort of makes the case more for richness almost better than I could myself, and the fact that there are a lot of people who don't want a rich list to exist. They don't want us to track these people because they think it's sort of gaudy. And the people on the list would rather we stop doing what we do at times, or some of them would do anyway, because they want the privacy. They want to be able to accumulate their wealth quietly without scrutiny. We think it's a very important functioning part of a democracy is that we know where wealth is being accumulated and where it lies. I think the fact that the person in charge of the public finances, in charge of tax in this country, has now made it onto this list, I think perfectly demonstrates why we need to do what we do.
Well, that was Robert Watts, who compiled the Sunday Times Rich List. Paul, I want to come to you on this. What do you make of the fact that the Chancellor is on this list?
I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of kind of personalising issues in this way and picking on particular people or particular politicians and highlighting their wealth. Having said that, I do think there's an argument to be made that if you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer and you are ultimately making decisions in terms of public finances and you're telling people how they can save money, etc., then if you personally are so insulated, as clearly Rishi Sunak and his family are, from the everyday effects of the cost of living crisis, then people probably are entitled to question the credibility of statements that are made by the Chancellor on issues like that. I think the bigger issue in many respects, Deanna, is not just about one individual. It's about the fact that there's a rich list that shows a huge disparity in wealth in this country between rich and poor. That's the real issue here, and that's a disparity, by the way, that increased as a result of the pandemic. There were some people at the top of society who did very, very well, thank you, out of the pandemic, when millions of people at the lower end of the scale took a big hit. And those are the issues that we need to address, and we need to address how we close that gap, because an increasing gap between rich and poor is never healthy for any country and invariably ends in tears. And you know, why isn't the government, for example, talking about a wealth tax? A wealth tax of 1% on the richest people would raise billions of pounds to fund our public services, to give people decent pay increases, to fund the National Health Service and schools, etc. But that doesn't even seem to be part of the government's thinking, and that's disappointing, I think.
Arlene, what's your read on this?
Well, I mean, we always look forward to the rich list coming out, don't we, just to check about who's on it and who's not on it. And I think there is a bit of the politics of envy that comes out during this time, and we look at it and we're very envious about what's going on. But listening to the compiler of the rich list, I mean, I, like Paul, I'm a little bit, it's really into people's private lives and what they do in their private lives. But at the same time, I do recognise that when you have on the rich list the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think that is something that we need to be aware of, because absolutely, I mean, he could be making decisions which impact upon his wealth. And I think that we need to be aware that he is one of the richest people in the UK. And I think there's very much maybe a conflict of interest in relation to that. And it's something that not only he should consider, but that the Prime Minister should consider. I mean, you do get down to the fact that he is in charge of the public finances. It's him that makes the decisions for everybody in the UK, and he's one of the richest people in the UK. So, you know, that's something to think about, and I'm sure it's something that will be in the minds of the Prime Minister when he has his reshuffle coming up, whenever that comes.
Mm-hmm. Well, let us know your thoughts. Send us your views. We always want to hear from you. What did you make of this year's Sunday Times Rich List? Email us gbviews@gbnews.uk. But coming up after the break, we're joined by a Scottish Lib Dem to talk about dentist shortages. We're also discussing footballer Jake Daniels and his decision to come out as gay. Don't go anywhere.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, welcome back to the Political Correction, and loads of you getting in touch. So many of you that we've got a massive piece of paper. That's a normal size, and that's the size of the one with the views on. So you can see loads of you getting in contact. John Taylor here says, the unions made this country a laughingstock in the 1970s. Margaret Thatcher broke them and restored some pride. It seems the unions want to take us back to those dark days of the 1970s. Paul, over to you.
Well, I mean, look, that's people always say that, don't they? Whenever workers, come together and say, we're not accepting this anymore, we want fairness, we want a decent pay increase. Oh, you're taking us back to the 1970s. I just don't think it's either realistic, actually, a fair interpretation of history, or reasonable interpretations of what unions are asking for now. Anyway, Mick, on the same theme but taking a different point of view, says, I've always voted Conservative and always been a trade unionist. The right to strike must be upheld. Good for you, Mick, on the being a trade unionist thing, not on the voting Conservative.
Arlene, over to you.
Yeah, so Camilla says, to strike at occasions that hurt as many people as possible cannot be justified. It is blackmail at its worst and should be curtailed. So I think she's on the side of the Tories taking action in relation to strikes, Deanna.
Mm-hmm. And we've got loads. I mean, Jennifer here, it's a long one. And Arlene, it starts with some praise for you. Jennifer says, Arlene is right 100%. Unions are too big and work in their own favour and not in the interest of the people. For instance, in education, the unions never protected the children or the teachers, and the whole fiasco, shutting schools, mass, etc., has damaged our children's lives. It's disgusting, and the unions were to blame, not the teachers. They're also anti-monarchy, and that is why they are targeting the Jubilee celebrations. They are the elites that want control and do nothing to help the people they are supposed to support. I never had any support from my union, had a genuine case. They work too closely with big business as well, and I had to go to a solicitor. Get rid of the unions because they are deep state and do not work for the people. Strong views there from Jennifer.
We'll put Jennifer down as a don't know, shall we?
I think we should.
Her surname wasn't Thatcher by any chance. Helen says, just bring in the army to run the train service like we brought them in to help with vaccines and ambulances. You don't strike when we have problems already in the country. Well, I have to say, if that were the case, then no one would ever strike at all, would they? Well,
and Arlene, a final one from you?
Yeah, and a final one for me. I was in a trade union for 35 years only because the printing industry was a closed shop. I'm proud of the fact that I never paid the Labour Party levy. The union never did anything for me. They controlled the jobs. You could never go for a new job without the permission of the union. So that's about union control as well.
Well, loads of your views, which we always love hearing, so do keep them coming in. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. Now, the Liberal Democrats have warned that England is facing a dentist shortage crisis as 14% of NHS dentists approach retirement. The party's spokesperson for health, Daisy Cooper, said ministers were asleep at the wheel, adding it was no wonder people were turning to DIY dentistry. Spokesperson for the Department of Health said the government had provided an extra £50 million to fund up to 350,000 extra dental appointments. Paul, what do you make of this? Have you had any sort of trouble yourself accessing dentistry services?
I mean, I think the Lib Dems have got a point, actually, and good on them for raising it. I think there is a real dental crisis in this country, which has been exacerbated, actually, as a result of the pandemic, when dental surgeries were operating on reduced capacity. That's created all sorts of problems in terms of people having personal problems and reopening afterwards and having that backlog. And I think there is a real problem in the sense that, poor people can't afford to go private. If you've got wealth, then you can afford to bypass the National Health Service and book a private appointment, often with the same dentist, bizarrely. But poor people don't have that luxury. So what they end up doing is either suffering in pain or, as you said in the intro there, Deanna, undertaking DIY dentistry, which, you know, is an unconscionable thing, I think, for any person to ever have to consider. But I think on the broader point, actually, it's kind of, it's indicative of what I think is a wider problem of things just not quite working properly. It's not just dentists, it's GP surgeries. Nowadays, if you try to book an appointment with your GP, you're having to wait for 6 weeks. If you want to get a passport, you struggle to get a passport. If you want a new driving licence, you struggle. If you try and contact HMRC, it's a problem. The whole thing has got a sense of the system not working properly and actually falling down. And I think what we see in the crisis in the dentistry service is really an example of that.
Well, Paul, is this you saying that the state isn't always the best provider of services?
The state can be the best provider of services, provided it's managed properly and funded properly, and under Conservative governments, that's generally not the case. There's your answer to that.
I knew that would be the comeback. Arlene, what have kind of you seen in Northern Ireland with dentistry services? Is it a very similar picture?
It is a similar picture, Deanna, and I have to say I agree with Paul on the GPs as well, because that's a real problem here in Northern Ireland. As you know, GPs in the past used to be single GP operations. People have moved away from that into federations and working together in practices, and it's very difficult for people to access their GP now in a way that they did in the past when we were growing up. It was very easy to access your GP and get a same-day appointment, and that's now not the case. And I think that something is fundamentally wrong there, and it needs to be fixed. And I don't agree that government is the answer to all of the problems, but government have a role to play in relation to dealing with the dental issues and indeed the GP issues as well.
Well, joining us now to discuss this story more is Lib Dem Treasury spokesperson Christine Jardine. Christine, thank you for joining us on this story. Tell us, you know, what is the Lib Dem stance? What more do you think should be done?
Well, we have a situation at the moment where 1 in 8 dentists is approaching retirement age. And we have, in Scotland, there is a problem as well. And we had 400,000 fewer appointments through the NHS after the pandemic than before the pandemic. Now, that's an awful lot of people not going to the dentist. It's particularly bad. The shortage is particularly bad in rural areas of England like Cornwall, Dorset, Devon, and there's also a GP crisis. So we're facing a situation where we really have to do something. And instead of just throwing £50 million at the problem and then waiting to see what happens, and it's interesting, when the Minister answered the question this week, that she didn't actually know how many dentists had applied for this money and how much support there was. So we have to incentivise dentists to be offering NHS appointments to people. We have to be encouraging them to make that time available and funding those appointments, because let's not forget, toothache, it's very painful, but it can also be indicative of a different health problem. It can be indicative of a heart problem. It can be mouth cancers. It can be all sorts of things. So the worst possible thing is for people not to be going and getting it checked out and getting treatment. And this is what we have to be looking at now. Something has to be done about this shortage. And the government can't just sit in its hands. It has to incentivise NHS work and make sure the funding is there for more dentists, because if 1 in 8 are going to retire, then we're going to face a shortage.
It should look like, Christine, in terms of trainee dentists, have we got huge numbers coming through, or do we need to do more to encourage young people to consider dentistry as a profession?
Well, we need to do more. And we also have health services generally. I don't think we're doing enough to encourage young people to take those courses through university and hospitals and get into the profession. And we do have a shortage of dentists coming through. And those 1 in 8, if they retire, that's a huge loss to dental care in England. And in Scotland, we're seeing the same thing. And we saw at the switchover about 20 years ago in Scotland, there was a huge shortage of NHS dentists. And we had people queuing in the street to have their teeth looked at because it was so bad. Now, that's a basic health service, and we getting to the point where we're just not providing it in the way that we promise to people when we talk about cradle to grave care. It's just not there. And the point about it not just being dental services is absolutely right. In my constituency, my inbox is full every week of people who haven't been able to get driving licenses, whose passports have gone missing or haven't come back in time, visas that the government is at the moment facing a huge backlog in visas. And part of that is understandable because of the number of refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine, but they're not dealing with it. So all the government departments seem to be struggling to cope. And that's very dangerous for all of us.
I think there must be some recognition, though, that obviously the unprecedented impact of the pandemic will have had an impact on these services, though.
Well, it would have had an impact. At the time, we weren't able to go to the dentist. But now we should be seeing people going back to the dentist and able to go back to the dentist because there is an NHS service available to them. But at the moment, we're finding that is not the case. As I say, there's a drop in the number of NHS appointments, a massive drop in Scotland, almost 500,000. And we're looking at the situation where 1 in 8 dentists could be retiring shortly in the next 5 years. Now, we need to replace those dentists. We need to replace, those are all dentists, incidentally, providing NHS service. So we need to replace them, and we need to incentivise practices not to prioritise private care, but to prioritise NHS care. There are practices now which simply don't offer NHS care to patients. They're not taking on NHS patients. Now, that means you're getting an inequality of care in this country. People who can afford to go to the dentist are getting dental care, and people who can't are struggling to find it. And I think that's unacceptable.
And Christine, you're talking about incentivising practices to take on more NHS patients or to take them on at all. How would the Lib Dems propose doing that? Is it through a change in the law, a change in structures, or more financial incentives?
Yes, I mean, we do have to look at the contracts that dentists have and see and have within the contracts an incentive to take on NHS patients. That would be the first thing that we would review. But also you need to make the funding available. And it's not simply good enough just to throw the funding at it, because that won't work without the incentives within the contracts that they have to do a certain percentage of NHS patients every month, every week, every year. And that way we can be sure that dentists are aware of the problem and aware of the necessity of providing it.
Brilliant. Well, Christine, thank you for joining us to discuss this morning. Christine Jardine, Lib Dem MP and Treasury spokesperson. Now, Jake Daniels has become the UK's first active male footballer to come out as gay since Justin Fashanu back in 1990. The 17-year-old forward, who plays for Blackpool FC in the Championship, has said the decision to go public with his sexuality will leave him feeling free and confident. Daniels has been congratulated for his bravery by the likes of Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp, Man City forward Jack Grealish, and indeed the entire sporting community as a whole. Arlene, what did you make of this story? Because seeing Jake's kind of initial interview, I found it quite heartwarming myself.
Yeah, what struck me was the fact that it had been so long since Justin Fashanu, and I mean, it's quite incredible that he's only the second to come out and say that he's gay, and he feels strongly that he wants to talk about that so that he doesn't have to live some sort of a lie by pretending to be straight. But I mean, I found it very, I mean, initially I thought, why is this a story? And then when I heard that he was only the second to do it, I realised that's why it was a story, and that's why it had come to our attention. Really, from my point of view, it shouldn't be a story. If people have a different sexuality, that's a matter for them. It doesn't need to be talked about. But frankly, the fact that he's only the second is what makes it a story.
Mm-hmm. And also, you know, gives him such a huge opportunity to act as a really positive role model for other young people coming up through football who realise that they can sort of be themselves and embrace their own sexuality.
Well, that they can be themselves indeed, and that they don't have to talk about it if they don't want to. But if they do want to talk about it, that's fine too. I think that's the important point, because I don't think people should be forced to talk about their sexuality if they don't want to. But if they do want to, that's fine as well, so that you have that choice and you can make it, and it's an individual matter for you.
And Paul, what did you make of this story? I mean, is it quite shocking that in 2022 we only have one active out footballer?
Well, it was unquestionably a brave thing to do, but I think, if we're honest, it was inevitable that it was going to be very well received by the footballing community, by the wider public, by the media, etc. So the kind of admiration and praise that was lavished on Jake Daniels wasn't particularly surprising, and I do contrast that with 32 years ago. I mean, I remember someone who's quite passionate about football. I remember Justin Fashanu coming out in 1990, and he had a pretty horrendous time because of it. And the difficulties that he faced compared to Jake Daniels' situation, I think, shows how football and society back then were very, very different. And of course, it's no bad thing that if, as Arlene said, someone wants to speak about their sexuality. I mean, I have to say, I'm frankly not that interested in the sexuality of footballers, but if they want to talk about it, then of course they're free to do so, and it's right and proper that their bravery is recognised.
Mm-hmm. But Paul, you wanted to contrast it with another case from football this week.
Yeah, Idrissa Gueye, the PSG player, who chose really as an act of conscience, because he's a devout Muslim, what we understand to be an act of conscience, so it's been reported, not to take part in a particular game because he was being asked alongside his teammates to display the rainbow symbol on his shirt, and he wasn't comfortable with that. And he didn't make any drama or fuss about it. He just simply quietly sat it out. And I think the contrast between that decision by Idrissa Gueye and the fierce condemnation that he received compared to the reaction with Jake Daniels is interesting. Now, people may say, well, the situations are completely different and Idrissa Gueye is some sort of homophobe. Now, you can disagree, but it was unquestionably, in my view, a brave thing to do, to say, look, effectively, I know I'm going to be hammered for this, but I do it because it's an act of conscience on my part. And I have to say, the reaction to him, I find slightly chilling. The fact that the French football authorities wrote to him, and the letter's subsequently been published, and it was a Gestapo-style letter, frankly, saying that we understand that this is what you've done, and we insist that you renounce your own views, words to that effect, and you should have a photograph taken of yourself wearing the shirt with the rainbow symbol. I think that kind of approach is pretty disgraceful, and I was struck really by the marked contrast in the two situations. And I don't like compelled speech. I don't like people being told they have to promote a particular ideology that they are not comfortable with, and that is what the situation with Idrissa Gueye ultimately boils down to.
Arlene, I see you nodding away there.
No, I entirely agree. I mean, the whole point is it should be choice, and it's a choice if you want to come out and talk about your sexuality. It's also a choice if you feel, because of your religious convictions, that you don't want to wear a rainbow symbol. And it's the fact that there's been such a Gestapo-like reaction to this young footballer who, as Paul said, didn't make a big issue about it. He just quietly said, I'm not going to play in the game, wasn't making himself a poster boy in any way. But unfortunately for him, he has now become the recipient of attacks. And I think that's just wrong. I think it's very wrong. And if we live in a free society, there has to be choice.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to move on to a very short story before we go to our break. Because celebrity chef and campaigner Jamie Oliver has been protesting outside Downing Street, armed with an eaten mess dessert. It was following a decision from the government to delay implementing part of its obesity strategy. It was announced last week that a ban on promotional offers around unhealthy food would be pushed back due to the cost of living crisis. And we talked about this on the show last week. Paul, what do you make of this protest? And isn't there something a little bit rich from multimillionaire Jamie Oliver saying the government are wrong to try and reduce the cost of food in the midst of a cost of living crisis?
Well, when I heard the term eaten mess, I thought that was the bloke who's going to be buying Twitter. I got that completely wrong. But look, I mean, I think this is a question of priorities, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of bans on certain foods. You know, I understand when we've got an obesity crisis, it's perhaps a good thing to warn people, you know, to have product warning and so on and so forth. I don't particularly like the idea of bans. And I just think at the moment, people's priority is just getting food on the table during a cost of living crisis. I tend to think you're right, Deanna. People don't take kindly to being lectured when they're struggling to make ends meet from rich celebrities saying you should pay for this food instead, which invariably is more expensive. So I saw the protest. It didn't particularly have my support, and I wouldn't have joined it if I were walking past, let's put it that way.
And Arlene, pretty pitiful protest, wasn't it?
It was, and I think the fact that he had an eaten mess, above all things, to protest about buy one, get one free was quite incredible. I mean, he's obviously tone deaf as to what is going on in the UK at the moment. And I listened to a young man who was on the protest, and he was saying how terrible it was that the government wasn't taking action to protect him against buy one, get one free. And I thought, well, you're not forced to buy one, get one free, you know. It's all of this.
Absolutely.
It's back to this scenario that government has to tell us what to do and to ban things for us to be. I mean, people have self-will. People have the ability not to do these things. So why does government have to get involved in this?
Absolutely. Well, there is the eaten mess, and we want to hear your views on the Jamie Oliver protest. Is he justified, or are the government doing the right thing? Send us your views, but that is it for the first hour of the Political Correction. We want to hear from you, so get involved. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you shortly.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to the Political Correction on GB News. Coming up this hour, our regular We Work For You segment with Christian Wakeford, MP. We'll discuss English nationalism and Peter Hitchens' suggestion that England should break away from the United Kingdom. US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wades into the row over the Northern Ireland Protocol. All this plus plenty more after the latest news with Bethany.
Thanks, Deanna. Good morning. It's 1 minute past 11. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. Number 10 says the Prime Minister did not request a meeting with senior civil servant Sue Gray, and that he hasn't tried to influence the outcome of her investigation into Partygate in any way. Labour called on Boris Johnson to urgently explain what they'd discussed, with Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner saying people deserve to know the truth. 2 cabinet ministers have objected to imposing a windfall tax on oil and gas firms as a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis. Labour is calling on a one-off levy on firms profiting from globally high oil and gas prices, using the revenue to ease the burden of rising household bills. But the Northern Ireland Secretary has said it won't work and will put off investors in the sector. And the Health Secretary is warning sudden taxes can have a long-term impact on businesses. The government could introduce a minimum staff requirement during rail strikes. It's as unions threaten major industrial action over pay. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps told the Sunday Telegraph ministers are considering making industrial action illegal unless a certain number of people are working. Political commentator Portia Berry-Kilby told GBNews rail strikes aren't a sensible or compassionate move during a cost of living crisis.
By creating even more complications to people's commute to work, it might threaten other people's ability to earn money. It doesn't really seem the most sensible or even the most compassionate of decisions. Grant Shapps, by saying that there will not be kind of all power to the unions, is making a stand and saying that things have to change, and unions, all very well and good, can represent to some extent, but also can't kind of hold a gun to the government's head.
Ukraine has ruled out a ceasefire or concessions to Moscow as Russian forces intensify an offensive in the eastern region of Donbass. US President Joe Biden has signed a bill to provide £30 billion in military, economic and humanitarian aid to the country. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has cut off its gas supply to Finland after they refused Moscow's demands to pay in rubles. Ukraine's presidential advisor says Kyiv wouldn't accept any deal that involves giving up territory.
Any concession to the Russian Federation would instantly lead to an escalation of the war. So the war will not stop. It will just be put on pause for some time. After a while, with renewed intensity, the Russians will build up their weapons, manpower, and work on their mistakes. And they'll start a new offensive, even more bloody and large-scale.
Survivors of the Manchester Arena terror attack are marking its 5th anniversary today with a 10-kilometre race through the city. More than 20,000 people, including the Mayor Andy Burnham, will take part in the Great Manchester Run. It's in memory of the 22 people that were killed when a bomb was detonated at an Ariana Grande concert on the 22nd of May in 2017. Colin Parry, who lost his 12-year-old son Tim in an IRA bombing, says losing a child is the worst thing that can ever happen to a family.
It was a gruesome event for the bomber to target a pop concert where he must have known the huge majority of the audience would be children, young people. It's the most callous of bombings. Any attack, of course, on civilians is beyond reproach, but that was particularly awful.
Australia's Labour Party will form the country's new government from tomorrow, making a way for a greener way of living. Voters, mostly women campaigning for climate change, targeted seats held by Scott Morrison's Liberal Party, ending 9 years of Conservative coalition. A Canberra University professor spoke of fierce desires to get accountability back into Australian politics. Local media reports Labour, which hasn't been in power since 2013, is just short of a majority of 76 seats and may need support of smaller independent parties. And the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall are set to make a cameo in a TV soap. They'll guest star in a special episode of EastEnders to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Charles and Camilla will surprise residents of Albert Square at a street party to celebrate Her Majesty's 70 years on the throne. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's get back to political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. Coming up this hour, we have our regular We Work For You segment with Labour MP Christian Wakeford. After journalist Peter Hitchens suggests England should secede from the United Kingdom, we'll discuss the concept of English nationalism. The Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has waded into the Northern Ireland Protocol dispute. We'll speak to the Deputy Editor of Breitbart London about her comments. And as always, if you want to get involved in the conversation, then email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Now, as you know, on The Political Correction, we explore the work done by our elected representatives, what they get up to on the ground and as legislators to serve us and the constituents who elect them. Well, this week's guest hit headlines in January this year when he made a very public defection from the Conservatives to Labour following Partygate allegations. But away from party politics, what has Christian been up to serving his constituents in Westminster? Well, I'm delighted to say that Christian joins us now. Christian, thank you for joining us today. I want to start off with one of the campaigns that you're really passionate about, and this is around alcohol harms. You spoke to Gloria Del Piero about this a few months ago. Tell us a bit about that campaign and why it's something that's so important to you.
Well, I guess very similar to you, Dee, with your story as to how you're campaigning for one-punch assaults. For me, it was a personal tragedy that got me working on alcohol harm because just over 7 years ago, I got the knock on the door by the police to tell me that my brother had died. It turned out that he had been suffering from alcohol addiction. He'd been in hospital to try to overcome some of that. But it turned out that actually when you try to deal with addiction, you also need to deal with the mental health side of it. And unfortunately, it was only trying to tackle one of those. So he tragically died in a car crash whilst over the limit. And I think really, from my perspective, it was to make sure that no one else goes through what me and my family did do, because it did tear the heart out of the family, really.
And so you're campaigning on alcohol harms at the moment. Tell us a little bit about how that's going.
So I first mentioned it in the Commons Chamber, about 2 years ago now, essentially asking for an alcohol strategy. And 2 years later, we still don't have one. When we're talking about addiction, no one chooses to be an addict. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is a 20% increase in alcohol-related deaths, an 11% increase in deaths from mental disorders due to alcohol, and a 15% increase in deaths due to fatal alcohol poisoning. So if anything, the country's going backwards. But we're seeing people's drinking behaviours have certainly changed during the COVID pandemic. And like I said, no one chooses to be an addict, but what we're asking for isn't a huge change. We're asking for more information on alcohol labels so that people can be truly informed about what they're consuming. Ideally, a change to the Equality Act so that there can be an employment support for those people who are suffering from addiction. I mean, if you were a cancer patient, you'd be allowed time out to go for your chemo or radiotherapy sessions. So, surely there should be something to help you if you need to go to rehab or to any sort of treatment services. But at the moment, that's lacking because there is a memorandum of exclusion in the Equality Act because addiction is still seen as a personal choice. So I think really it's about trying to inform as many people as possible. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to preach abstinence or temperance. It's just about making sure there's as much information out there for all consumers as possible, really.
Thanks, Christian. Well, it's one that we'll follow closely on this show, but on another medical front, you're also campaigning on sodium valproate, aren't you?
Yeah, so the main campaign group, in fact, so the two fantastic women of Emma Murphy and Janet Williams. Emma Murphy is actually one of my constituents. So what we've seen in recent years is they've been blacklisted by the Department of Health, so they wouldn't even engage with them. In regards to the Cumberledge report, we've seen that actually the recommendations haven't been stuck to. So these warnings on medication, and this is a epilepsy medication, is sodium valproate, also known as Epilim. There's no warnings in some of these packages, even now, despite the fact we've known about this since 1973. So we're thinking there's as many as 20,000 babies that could be affected, and this is given a wide range of disabilities. From autism to cerebral palsy to other deformities. And I think what we're asking for is to make sure that these warnings are going out, that GPs are talking about sodium valproate dangers to any women, really, and especially those of childbearing age or looking at having a child. But then we also need to make sure that there is a suitable redress scheme, very similar to what happened with the thalidomide scandal. So on the back of a PMQ a few weeks ago, we have been able to have a meeting with Maria Caulfield, the minister. That actually went really well. So we do have a follow-up meeting that's going to be scheduled in the next few weeks. So hopefully some of these things can be turned around relatively quickly, whilst we're trying to ultimately get justice to correct what is ultimately a very, very terrible wrong.
Well, two really strong campaigns you're running there, Christian. But while you're here, it would be daft of me not to ask about the obvious topic, the thing that's kind of got you in the headlines, and that is your defection. How does it feel on a personal level? And do you find that there are people you were close to in the Conservative Party that you're now not as close to?
It feels mixed, and Dee, you're one of my very good friends down in Westminster, and there's people like you and many of who will still openly give me a hug in Portgoy's house, and that's nice. I think the overall
now,
consensus is, well, if you were here, Dee, there'd be a big hug for you too. But I think the overall consensus is that, do people agree? No. I mean, if they did, they'd cross with me. But they're a friend, so they want to make sure I'm okay. There are a few, especially my older friendships, that have soured, and I'm not talking to. And one of these was the best man from my wedding, and that's tough. But in regards to how I feel, mentally, physically, I feel a lot better. And if it was a case of, would I make the same decision tomorrow? Yes, the only thing I'd try to change would be how it impacted on friends, but I don't know how I do that. But with everything we've seen with Number 10 and Boris since then, I think it's clearly the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
Christian, as a long-standing member of the Labour movement, I can perhaps ask the same question, but from the other end of the telescope. I mean, clearly, it's difficult for a Tory to defect to the Labour Party, not only in terms of the reaction of his former colleagues, but what the reaction might be of his new colleagues and comrades, dare I say. And I just wondered, in your case, what's the reception been like within the party and the wider movement since you joined the ranks? Welcome, by the way.
And thank you for the welcome. In regards to the PLP, it's been incredibly warm. I've had quite a few just general conversations from anything mundane, from football, and I'm not talking about that today because hopefully we still qualify for Europa League. But from anything from that to just how things are going on in everyone's patch. The PLP's been warm. The CLP, I think for them it was a shock as well. And do I expect everyone to be my best friend on day one? No, because we have to be reasonable about this, but. Hopefully with having gone out campaigning most weekends, and even yesterday I was out in Wakefield for a by-election, the onus is on me to show that there's sincerity, and I've not done this just waking up one day thinking, oh, I'm going to be a Labour MP now. So it's the onus is on me, and hopefully that's trickling through to show that actually I am sincere about this. I do want it to work, and I do genuinely think people are coming around to it now.
And what has the response been like from your constituents, many of whom obviously voted for you as a Tory MP and now are left with something different?
So I think there is a loud but vocal minority who even now are demanding a daily by-election. I think on the whole, including from my Jewish constituents, I've had quite a few who've written to me, even now congratulating me over the decision, but saying actually it's giving them the message they need, that actually they are welcome back in the Labour Party now. So I think it is a mix, but I would say it's very much more on the positive side. And we only need to look to the results from a couple of weeks ago, where actually we increased our majority on the council and actually made several gains as well. So I do think, whilst it is mixed, it is very much leaning towards the positive.
Mm. Well, Christian, thank you for joining us on the show this morning. And I think what this proves is that there's kind of a bit more to life and a bit more to friendships than politics alone, because despite the fact he's crossed the floor and he's on the wrong side now, Christian and I still are pals, and I think that'll be the case for a long time to come. Christian, thank you so much. Christian Wakeford, their former Tory MP, now Labour MP in Bury. Now, journalist Peter Hitchens has caused a stir this week after suggesting the English embrace their national identity and break away from the United Kingdom. Writing in the Daily Mail, Mr Hitchens said that English identity lives in millions of hearts and predicted that any manifesto with English independence in its agenda would comfortably win a general election. So what is English identity, and does it bear any similarity to Scottish and Welsh independence sentiments? Arlene, I'm kind of keen to come to you first on this. What do you make of this notion of kind of English independence?
Well, first of all, I think it's right that people should be proud of their Englishness. If you're English, you should be proud of that, just as I'm very proud to be Northern Irish. I think it's important that people have pride in who they are. But the lovely thing about being part of the United Kingdom is that I'm Northern Irish and British. I have that very strong tie with Scotland, Wales and England. And the United Kingdom is something that works and works very well in all its parts. It's not just about a transactional issue. I mean, Peter Hitchens talks about, England leaving the UK because we're the people that make all the money and therefore the rest of you can all go. I mean, that's not what it's about. It's about much more. It's about cultural ties. It's about emotional ties. It's about our identity as British citizens. So, I mean, this is Peter Hitchens being the contrarian. He's probably fed up listening to, as I am, Scottish nationalists and Irish Republicans talking about destroying the Union, talking about destroying Northern Ireland and trying to see the abolition of Northern Ireland and indeed having Scottish independence. So I understand why he's frustrated listening to all of that. But I mean, the answer is not for England to leave the United Kingdom. The answer is to have a stronger union.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm kind of curious about, and Paul, maybe you can help shed some light on this. Do you think there is an English identity in the same way that there's a very kind of strong Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish identity? Because to me, it feels like in England, it's a little bit more regional than kind of national.
No, I think there is, actually. I think there is a sense of being Englishness, of being English, a sense of Englishness, a sense of being proud of England. But what I think, Deanna, is that tends to exist much more in what you might call provincial England, small-town England, often working-class England, than it does in the fashionable cities where lots of people tend to take the view, we're citizens of the world and don't really feel any attachment to England. And in some respects, that's a contradiction, because often these same people will be more than happy to fan the flames of Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism. And you can understand why English people feel a bit left behind, because they see the cultural elites, if you like, indulge in these other nationalisms and saying, they're a force for good and how wonderful St Nicola Sturgeon is, etc. And I think some people are possibly making the argument in respect of Sinn Féin now being the largest party in Northern Ireland. And I know Arlene has strongly disagreed with this point, but some people have suggested that there's now going to be a move towards a united Ireland. Northern Ireland's no longer going to be part of Britain. And in Wales, too, a similar kind of sentiment. And I think English people just kind of think, what about us? We don't have our own parliament. Our country is rarely mentioned in official documents. We're not allowed to celebrate our identity, even though we feel we do have an identity. And I think Peter Hitchens has tapped into that, and it's probably a right debate to be having at this moment in time.
I think something that I always find interesting about kind of English nationalism compared to elsewhere in the UK is often it's kind of associated with this sort of nasty kind of racist sentiment, which is completely false. But, we saw it, didn't we, a few years back when Emily Thornberry was out campaigning, saw Houses with England flags up and sort of made assumptions about what the people of that household must be like and what their views must be. How on earth do we try and break that view? Because there are, as you said, Paul, there are places in the country that throw great sort of St George's Day parades, as we saw in Morley, for example. And yet there is this sect that see an England flag and seem to kind of implode. What's going on?
I think George Orwell said, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he said words to the effect of, there's no intelligentsia in the world who hate their own country so much as the English intelligentsia. And I think that's perfectly true, actually. And I think it does derive from that kind of idea that England, you know, as being the main country in the empire, has still got blood on its hands, and, you know, there's nothing to be proud of. And people who, for some reason, seem to want to find the bad in our history the whole time, rather than looking... And, of course, you know, empire was a mixed bag. Let's be blunt, there were some terrible things done in the name of empire, but some good things as well. But I don't see any reason why we shouldn't celebrate the good things about our country. And it's not just the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh, but if you go across the world, most people have pride in their country. I mean, I was struck by the fact that when Keir Starmer gave a speech in front of the Union flag, parts of the left just absolutely hammered him as if he'd done something along the lines of a far-right politician. This kind of stuff is perfectly normal in France and Japan and places where people feel a collective sense of identity because they're part of the same political and cultural and economic unit. But for some reason, English people have been told, you know, you have to quell any sense of Englishness because it's reactionary and it's wrong. And we've got, you know, we're still soaked in blood from the 19th century. It's a nonsense, of course, and as I say, that's why I think that sense of Englishness exists beyond the professional and managerial classes, beyond the fashionable cities, and is much more prevalent out there in blue-collar provincial England.
Well, coming up next on the political correction, US House Speaker and key Biden ally wages into the row on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We'll speak to Jack Montgomery from Breitbart London about this. And we'll have a regular Common Ground segment with Calvin Robinson. But as always, we want to hear from you. So let us know your thoughts on potential English independence. Send your views to gbviews at gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction. Don't go anywhere.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it. Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction, and as always, loads of you getting in contact with us. This is one that you will love, Paul. It's about the unions. Sue says, Paul is annoying my husband today. He should have lived through the 60s and 70s. It was awful, and the working classes were treated badly by union leaders like Scargill. He lived like a lord, and the miners starved. You're annoying Sue's husband.
Well, Sue, I would say in response that whatever you say about Arthur Scargill, he was proved right because he warned in 1984 that the mining industry would be decimated. Thatcher's government said at the time that he was scaremongering, and further down the line we can look back and say, well, who called it right and who called it wrong? On dentists, Maxina says, I rarely agree with the Lib Dems, but they are totally correct to highlight this one. It's impossible to get onto an NHS dentists list in the whole of Sussex. If you cannot pay, you have no recourse to treatment.
Arlene?
Yeah, and Nick says that GPs' pay must be regulated on the number of appointments and time and practice, and the practice of advising patients to book appointments on the day so that they can class it as an emergency appointment to boost their stats is immoral. So there's been quite a lot of reaction to the dentist issue and indeed the GP issue, Deanna.
And we've got on the Jake Daniels story, Jake says, I think the media hype around Jake Daniels coming out will be counterproductive. I feel it will put more players off coming out. That's an interesting one. And I think that comes back to an argument you made, Arlene, which is that people should be free to talk about it or not talk about it as they see fit. And some people might not want that level of kind of attention or scrutiny about their sort of sexuality. Paul, have you got some more for us?
Yeah, Alan says the Labour Party constantly banging on about the working class. Surely whether you earn £15 or £50,000, if you go to work, you are working class. Have the Labour Party got a cut-off point where if you earn below a threshold, you are working class? That's an interesting question that we could debate all night long, Alan, but probably don't have the time.
Yes, indeed. Well, we'll do more views later, but first, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has waded into the dispute over the Northern Ireland Protocol, telling the UK government that discarding it could threaten future trade between our two nations. Pelosi reaffirmed Congress's support for the Belfast Agreement, but the intervention has been met with backlash from unionists, including DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, saying the comments are entirely unhelpful. So what do we make of Pelosi's comments? Arlene, I'm going to have to come to you first on this.
Oh dear, Deanna, Paul, I'm weary of Nancy Pelosi, I have to say. I mean, she just takes her comments straight out of the Sinn Féin handbook. She says she wants to protect the Belfast Agreement, but then goes on to talk about we can't have a border on the island of Ireland. Well, sorry, that's not what the Belfast Agreement says, actually. You need to read the Belfast Agreement. She talks about, militarised borders. Well, the militarised borders were there not to stop trade, Nancy. They were there to protect Northern Ireland at a time of terrorist insurrection. They were there to stop Semtex, not sausages. So the military border that she's actually talking about is not what's going to come about in terms of trade. And trade can be dealt with through, we've talked about this, through technology, through trusted trader, through all of the other ways. And there doesn't need to be a physical border in the manner in which she thinks of. So, I mean, it's the level of willful misunderstanding of what the Belfast Agreement is, what happened in the past. And it's just so, as Sir Geoffrey Donaldson said, I mean, it's just so unhelpful to have this person intervening in this way.
Well, I'm sure someone who would agree with you is the Deputy Editor of Breitbart London, Jack Montgomery, who joins us now to discuss Pelosi's comments. Jack, fire away. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's perhaps informative to consider that the US midterm elections are coming up, and that there are an estimated 30 million Irish Americans who may be voting, in those elections, and that this might be informing Ms. Pelosi's position. Although this is something in her defence which she has been saying almost every year since Brexit. I was just looking into it. Because, I was sure, I've heard this before from old Nancy, you better submit to the European Union's wishes on Northern Ireland or we don't do a deal with you. It was a little bit of a Groundhog Day moment. And sure enough, if you go on the Speaker's website, you'll find a statement from 2020, which is almost worded exactly the same as the current one about, a beacon of light for the world and all the rest of it. It's been, cut and pasted almost. And as Ms. Foster says, of course, no one's talking about a physical border, a militarised border in Northern Ireland. They're talking about putting an end to a protocol which was never really agreed to by the Unionist community, which has left one half of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland half in, half out, not only of the European Union, but arguably of the United Kingdom. And far from underpinning peace and stability in the region, it has really inflamed a lot of ill feeling in the province, as we've seen with I think there was a couple of loyalist bus hijackings to protest, what they see as a sellout of Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom, and other protests. And the European Union's really shown no interest in trying to accommodate the Unionist community in Northern Ireland or the government in London on this issue. And I think it's a little strange that the Americans seem to think it's entirely incumbent on the United Kingdom to submit to the EU's demands in order for an accommodation to be reached. Surely Brussels and perhaps even Dublin need to come to the table with something, apart from, you made this deal in 2019 and you have to stick to it forever, no matter how badly it appears to be working out for you.
Absolutely. Well, Jack, I'm sorry we're pushed for time, but thank you so much for joining us briefly to discuss the Speaker's comments. Coming up next on The Political Correction, we have our regular Common Ground segment with Calvin Robinson, and we'll discuss the results of the Australian elections. But first, here's your latest news headlines with Bethany.
Thanks, Deanna. It's 11:34. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB Newsroom. Number 10 says the Prime Minister did not request a meeting with senior civil servant Sue Gray and that he hasn't tried to influence the outcome of her Partygate investigation. Labour called on Boris Johnson to urgently explain what they'd discussed, with Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner saying people deserve to know the truth. The cost of living gap between rich and poor households has reached the highest ever since records began in 2006. The Resolution Foundation has found inflation for the poorest tenth has now hit 10.2%, compared with 8.7% for the richest. 2 cabinet ministers have objected to imposing a windfall tax on oil and gas firms as a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis. Labour says the tax revenue could be used to ease the burden of rising household bills. But the Health Secretary and Northern Ireland Secretary say it won't work and could have a long-term impact on businesses. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has told the Sunday Telegraph ministers are considering new laws to make industrial action illegal unless a certain number of staff are working. It's as the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union threatens major strike action over pay. And survivors of the Manchester Arena terror attack are marking its 5th anniversary today with a 10-kilometre race through the city. More than 20,000 people, including the Mayor Andy Burnham, are taking part in the Great Manchester Run. It's in memory of 22 people that were killed when a bomb detonated at an Ariana Grande concert in May 2017. On TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. We'll get back to political correction in just a moment.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m, as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction, and a few more views. Paul, you're going to love this one. This is Leslie on the rich list. Says, please tell Paul, making a rich man poor does not make a poor man rich. A typical Labour mantra, tax success. There you go, that's Leslie, and I agree.
Well, it's nonsense, isn't it? Because if that were the case, then you would never tax anybody. You would never tax rich people at all, because in doing so, you know, it would have no effect, would it? So clearly, the fact that we do tax people in order to fund public services, pay people decent benefits and so on, is a measure of the fact that it can work to tax people. Do you want me to carry on, Deanna, or to read out a view of mine?
I think another view would be helpful.
OK, let's change the subject for a second. I could go on all night about that. But on the Jake Daniels affair, Helen says Jurgen Klopp can advise on Jake's bravery, which is fine. Klopp couldn't come out and condemn Liverpool fans for booing the future king. Double standards, Klopp, whatever suits your purpose. I think you may have a point on that, actually.
Well, keep your views coming in, because as always, we want to hear from you. As we know, Sunday is a special day for Christians, but here on GB News we acknowledge that faith comes in all shapes and sizes. And each week on The Political Correction, we aim to talk to someone at the heart of his or her community about what brings us together. In other words, our common ground. And I'm delighted to say that joining us now in the studio is seminarian and political commentator Calvin Robinson. Calvin, thank you for joining us here in the studio.
It's all my pleasure.
Today, so we're going to talk about one of your favourite subjects first. We're going to talk about wokeism, wokeism in the church.
Right.
Give us your thoughts.
Oh, it's taking over. It is the new religion, wokeism. People are obsessed with race, gender, sexuality, all of the immutable characteristics, the things about ourselves we cannot help. They're obsessed with dividing us on these and focusing on these as if they are the most important thing about us. Whereas in my faith, in Christianity, the thing that unites us is our Christian faith. We are all one in the identity of Christ. But even if you're not a Christian, surely you should be focusing on the fact that we're all British, no matter what religion, what race, ethnicity, all these things don't matter, sexuality, none of them matter. It's all about what brings us together. But the church is just another public institution that has become totally obsessed with woke. You know,
Calvin, is it beyond the point of redemption, to use the word, in the sense that, I mean, traditionally, as you know, the Church of England was called the Conservative Party at prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty much the Lib Dems at prayer now, isn't it, in terms of its kind of orthodox thinking? Expand on that then. You think it can be won back?
It's still Conservatives at prayer. The congregation, the masses, the faithful people who turn up and sit on the pews week in, week out are generally small c Conservative, as are most people in this country, I believe. The problem is the hierarchy. The bishops, they are the Lib Dems at prayer, and they are the ones sneering down their noses at people that read the Daily Mail, the Express, and watch GB News. They think they are above us for some reason. They have a moral superiority. They've forgotten that we're all equal. But can we reform it? Can we fix it? For the last few months and years, I've been of the argument, yes, we can. We need to change it from within. But I've come to the conclusion that actually that's pretty much a Ramona stance. And, throughout the Brexit referendum, I would say you cannot reform an institution that is corrupt. You need to leave it. And I've come to the conclusion that actually I need to leave the Church of England because I don't think it is redeemable.
The Brexit point is interesting, actually, because I recall bishops being asked for their views on Brexit at the time, and almost exclusively, certainly overwhelmingly, they were all in favour of remaining in the EU, some of them in quite a militant way, and some of them made these terrible, dire warnings of what would happen if we had Brexit go back to the 1930s. I imagine that probably wasn't a reflection of people in the pews as well on that issue.
No, I think 70% of the congregations voted to leave the European Union. So that's more than the people of the country, actually. Christians were more for vote leave than the vast majority of people. But the bishops, 1 out of 116 of them outwardly voted to leave the European Union. And he was demoted from a bishop back to a parish priest and sent to the far end of the British Empire. So that just goes to show you what you get for speaking out. You know, you stick your head above the parapet and it gets chopped off.
So you've said there, Calvin, that you're feeling like you're wanting to leave the Church of England. What next?
I'm going to join a movement called GAFCON. So the Anglicanism is bigger than just the Church of England. It's strong in Africa, where they stick to Christian traditional teaching. It's getting stronger in North America, where people have split from the Episcopal Church there and formed the ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America. And it's under an umbrella called GAFCON. And these are people that want to be Orthodox Anglicans, want to stick to traditional doctrine and not chase society with ever progressive norms on the issues of immutable characteristics, you know, such as marriage in the church is between a man and a woman. That is scriptural. That's how it works. People can have different ideas in the state, that's fine. But within the church, you cannot change the Bible. And people that want to do things like that, like re-blessing people that change gender, when the Bible would say, God made man male, God made woman female, and God made you in God's image, therefore he loves you for who you are in the body that you are in. All of these things are rooted in Christianity, and people are trying to push Christianity to address liberal progressive norms of the state, and that's inappropriate. So the GAFCON movement says, no, we're going to stick with tradition.
And a number of, just very quickly if I can, Deanna, sorry, a number of Anglicans have taken the path to Rome, Calvin, haven't they? You've never been tempted?
I'm too English for that. I could not trade down. No, I love my my Roman brothers and sisters, but I couldn't swim the Tiber. It's not, I couldn't do it.
Well, I'm going to throw to Arlene, because Arlene has got a question for you, Calvin.
Well, I'm very relieved with the last answer, Calvin, as you can imagine, in terms of Rome. But in terms of the Church of England and indeed the Church of Ireland, for that matter, do you think it's time for a new reformation? GAFCON is something that I'm very familiar with. It's a great organisation. So I'm wondering, is it time for a new reformation in the Church of England?
Perhaps, yes. I think disestablishment might be a good thing, separating church and state, just because the Church of England, as the established church, has a monopoly, so to speak, on Anglicanism in this country. And there are far more Anglican organisations than just the Church of England. I think they would thrive if the established church didn't have a chokehold on faith, especially if it's going away from faith and entering apostasy.
Well, Calvin, thank you so much for your time with us this morning. Calvin Robinson, seminarian and political commentator, and GBNews favourite, I think, at the moment.
Thank you.
Big hit on our channel. Now, Australians took to the polls on Saturday, with Labour's Anthony Albanese emerging as the country's new Prime Minister-elect, defeating the incumbent Scott Morrison and ending a decade of Conservative rule. Mr Albanese voted to clamp down on climate change and has said Australia could become a renewable energy superpower. But what does the change of government mean for Australia, the world, and of course for Britain's trade relations with its fellow Commonwealth nation? Well, joining us to discuss this week's results is the former Foreign Minister and former leader of the Australian Liberal Party, Alexander Downer. Alexander, what did you make of this week's results?
Well, it's been an extraordinary result, really. The Liberal Party, which was the governing Conservative Party, got about 35% of the vote. Labor got about 32%. And a large number of independents and Greens ended up with, somewhere in the vicinity of the high 20s as well. So because of the way the electoral system works, preferences are distributed, second preferences of voters are distributed, and the Labor Party ended up by being the winner. But I think this is a consequence of COVID. There were months or years, 2 years of repeated lockdowns, borders being closed, all sorts of social problems emerging from this, and quite apart from anything else, a massive budget blowout as the federal government funded compensation for the lockdowns. So, you know, people have become discombobulated about politics, really. It's not clear what the Liberal Party stands for, how it differentiates itself from the Labour Party, and the Prime Minister, him personally, became unpopular. So they kind of lost their way a bit, I felt, the Liberals in the end. And this is the thing about politics. You have to give people a reason to vote for you. Mm-hmm. You have to stand for things and make people think it's really, really worthwhile voting for you because you're going to do things. And they didn't have much of an agenda and much to say, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alexander, I think that giving people reasons to vote for you is definitely a sentiment that I can agree with. Arlene, I think you have a question?
Yeah, so it's good to see you, Alexander. And I was just wondering how you think the relationship will be between Boris Johnson and the new Prime Minister, given the fact that he is an avowed Republican, as I understand it, and may want to take the country in a different direction in respect of that.
Look, I don't think he will in relation to the Republic, because there's not much of a mood in Australia to move the country towards a republic. I think people agree with the basic proposition that it would be better for Australia to have an Australian as the head of state. But to achieve that, you'd have to not only get rid of the Queen, which would be incredibly unpopular because she's much loved in Australia, but it would lead to a great constitutional upheaval. And after all we've been through with COVID, I don't think people want a constitutional upheaval. As for relations with the UK, I think it will make a bit of a difference because the Liberal Party of Australia and the Conservative Party in the UK have always been very close, and the Australian Labor Party less committed to the relationship. Actually, Arlene, listening to you ask the question, it's worth making this point that the Labor Party has always had very much an Irish strand to it, and I don't mean Northern Irish, and so it's been, if you like, anti-English and therefore sort of anti-establishment and not very enthusiastic as it wasn't in the days of Paul Keating as the Prime Minister about the relationship with the UK. But Anthony Albanese doesn't have a reputation for being like that, actually. So I wouldn't have thought it will make a huge difference in the short term. In the medium term, there won't be that sort of bucket of love that there's been between the Australian and British governments over the last few years. That will fade.
Paul?
Alexander, in terms of the Australian Labor Party, I mean, obviously it was out of power in Australia for I think, a decade or more. Why was that? What did the Labor Party in Australia get so wrong? And what has it suddenly done right to win back power again?
Well, I don't think they have done much, actually. They haven't stood for much. They went into the election campaign with what is called a small target strategy. They didn't have too much in the way of policies, just a series of slogans of the various things they're going to do. We're going to be good for women. We're going to make the weather better. We're going to improve the climate and, you know, various slogans like that, but very ill-defined. I think it was much more a vote against the incumbents, really, after the upheaval of the last 2 or 3 years. So the Labor Party in Australia has never been as extreme as the Labor Party in the UK has become from time to time. So it's a much more moderate, much more middle-of-the-road sort of Labor Party, even than the Labor Party under Keir Starmer. So it doesn't frighten people, it doesn't frighten mainstream voters. But they haven't done much except, you know, not get themselves into trouble. Well, the Liberal Party have been in trouble as they've wrestled with COVID and some other issues over a long period of time.
Well, Alexander, thank you so much for joining us this morning to share your insights. Alexander Downer there, former leader of the Liberal Party of Australia. Now it's time for an update on the week's biggest stories from the world of sport, and I'm delighted to say we are joined here in the studio by our very own sports commentator and broadcaster, Aidan McGee. Aidan, another big weekend.
Huge weekend, probably the nadir of the football season, well, certainly the Premier League season. All sorts of permutations from the very top of the league, just below that in the Champions League places, and also at the bottom, of course. I'll start with the very top, of course. Manchester City going for the title. A win against Aston Villa sees them home and hosed, the fourth Premier League title in 5 years. For the benefit of our radio viewers, you can see Raheem Sterling and the rest of the Manchester City side training this week ahead of that huge game today. Now, if you give any team, certainly one of Manchester City's calibre and prowess, the opportunity to win the league by beating Aston Villa at home on the last day of the season, then you would take that. What I would say, there was a caveat, two things. You've got the Steven Gerrard factor. Steven Gerrard, Liverpool legend, unfulfilled Premier League career at Liverpool. That's not to say he didn't perform well, he just didn't lift the holy grail of the Premier League. They didn't do that until 2 years ago under Jurgen Klopp, some 5 years after Steven Gerrard had left. But can he go as Aston Villa manager today to Manchester City, to the Etihad, upset the odds and do his former club a massive favour? Maybe that is the realisation of his dream of winning the Premier League, even though he couldn't do it as a player. Second point is, with the system of prize money now, Deanna, you have a situation where Aston Villa lie in 14th place. Each place that they progress today, and incidentally, this is the only day in Premier League history in the last 30 years since the inception of the competition where every spot in the Premier League can move. That's never happened before. Wow. So, if Aston Villa win, and of course there's a huge order going to the Etihad and winning, and this won't even be the big story if they do it, the fact that they've beaten Manchester City will be much bigger and handed the title to Liverpool, presumably they beat Wolves, but if they go from 14th to 10th, £3 million per place, that's another £12 million in their back pocket this summer. It's astonishing. It's obscene, really. Liverpool, for their part, have to beat Wolves at home.
I'm offended you just automatically assumed Liverpool are going to beat my team.
Well, that's what you told me.
I did say that to him off air. I said, we've got no chance.
No loyalty.
Clubs like Villa and Wolves did the hard work earlier in the season. They secured themselves. They don't technically have anything to play for apart from prize money and places in the league, which is a good thing in a way. But having said that, we never know what's going to happen, and we don't know what's going to happen either with Tottenham and Arsenal. Local rivalry there as well, local spat. Arsenal turned up to St James's Park and rolled over like church mice, if that's the right, or I don't know, whatever rolls over. Yeah, maybe. So they lost at Newcastle. They didn't do their chances any good. And then obviously Tottenham can go to Norwich today and get a draw. Norwich already relegated. The wooden spoon is in the competition. Tottenham just need a point there because the goal difference is so superior. And then, of course, at the bottom, Burnley go to or host Newcastle, resurgent, as we just mentioned. They have to better Leeds' result. Or if it stays the same, if Leeds get a draw at Brentford and Burnley draw at home to Newcastle, it's Burnley stayed up. They've got a 20 better goal difference, and that will prove decisive. If Leeds go to Brentford just down the road from here and get a result, and then and Burnley lose or draw at home to Newcastle, it's Burnley who will go down after a period of 6 years in the Premier League.
It's fascinating that, as you say, every place can change. And actually, on the final day of the season, the title winners are not yet decided, because normally they are by now, aren't they? Long before now. And also, one of the teams that gets relegated hasn't yet been decided. I mean, in terms of...
don't forget, Everton only secured themselves on Thursday night.
Palace,
with all the furore that happened around there, they finally got themselves safe, and that was the bloodletting, really. We talked a lot about the aggro, didn't we, the football violence. Football violence we saw flashpoints, really, on Thursday and in this week. It's not the same as the football violence that you and I probably grew up with to some degree in the 80s, going all the way back to the late 60s, in fact. This was organised crime, effectively. These were ragtags of organisations calling themselves firms to reflect the fact that these individuals were holding down very good Monday to Friday jobs. If they're a London club, the chances are they worked in the city in a stockbroker bell, and ostensibly they turned into monsters at weekends. Some people joined the territorial army and become a weekend warrior. There are another demographic of people who decided, often from middle-class backgrounds as well, who decided to have very functional family lives in nuclear families, Monday to Friday, but turn into football hooligans at the weekend.
And the proof of that, I think, is this guy who headbutted Billy Sharp on the touchline at the Forest Sheffield United, your team, at that game, was apparently some guy previously had never been arrested for anything, earned £55,000 a year as an electrical engineer. So quite a respectable background, and then just goes and commits. It does something to people.
It took years. It took years. The police for years felt, it's got to be oiks from the local estate who are causing all this bother. Now, I'm not saying they weren't involved as foot soldiers, but the perpetrators and the organisers were completely different, from a completely different background, and until they got hold of that, the police, with the help of social scientists, they couldn't solve the problem.
Well, thank you for joining us on the show today. You've been watching and listening to The Political Correction. Join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours of discussion, debate and analysis of the week's biggest political stories. Up next, it's Alistair Stewart.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking rather cloudy in the northwest with some rain, but drier and brighter elsewhere. Let's take a look at the details for you. It will tend to be cloudier towards northern coasts in the southwest, where a little patchy rain is possible. Elsewhere, it will be mostly dry with warm, sunny spells. As we move eastwards to the southeast of England, we'll see there is very little cloud and plenty of prolonged, warm, sunny spells. South Wales will mostly be cloudy in the west with a little patchy rain here, the best of sunshine being in the east. Northern parts of the Midlands will be rather cloudy as we head into the afternoon, with the odd light shower possible at times.
Further south and east, it will be brighter with sunny spells moving up to the northeast of England. And it's mostly cloudy here at lunchtime. The cloud thick enough at times for a little bit of light rain or drizzle. Similar story as we head north to southern Scotland. Cloudy for most, patchy rain in the northwest and some heavy showers, mainly in the east. Over in Northern Ireland, it will also be rather cloudy this lunchtime, but mainly dry, and a few bright or sunny spells are possible, although the odd shower is likely to. Remaining cloudy with outbreaks of rain in the north and northwest, drier with warm sunny spells and scattered showers elsewhere.
Join me, Anaya Falarin Iman, for the discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here. From big ideas to questions shaping the public conversation, we tackle the moral, cultural and political implications of news stories.
We need to share this conversation democratically.
It has become so toxic, this debate.
They relish this kind of discourse.
From fascinating guests to challenging ideas, you won't want to miss it. The discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here, GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will know